All right, shall we get started, David?
Sure.
So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Meera Karunananthan. I'm the director of the Blue Planet Project, joining you today from Ottawa, which is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Blue Planet Project is a global initiative that promotes water justice by supporting frontline struggles against the privatization and commodification of water in various forms, including the privatization of water and sanitation services, which will be the topic of today's webinar. The webinar is part of a series called Contagion Cultures, which is hosted by Queen's University on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Queen's University was founded in 1841 by Queen Victoria. So as an institution of higher learning, it is also part of an imperial project. And the organizers of this series are among those who are committed to remembering that history and to striving to right the wrongs against Indigenous people and many peoples around the world, which continue today. This series is part of that hope to contribute in a positive way, to further various ways of thinking about how best to live with all of the planet, and work towards social, economic, racial justice. As part of this effort, I have the honor of introducing David McDonald, who I've known for many years. He is a professor in global development studies at Queen's and the director of the Municipal Services Project. David is one of the editors of a new book titled Public Water and COVID-19, Dark Clouds and Silver Linings. You can download the book for free if you haven't already. We can I'll post the link in the chat shortly. I should note that that we will use the Q&A. We'll have Q&A at the very end of the discussion, and we can use the Q&A function, so you can post your questions in the Q&A. I'd also like to invite everyone to introduce themselves using the chat function, so we know a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and if you want to use the chat function as well to share your contact information, that would be great, so we can stay in touch after this webinar. So before David, just a few things about the book. I think it's very exciting to have this book come out. Now it's a very important contribution to our work, our collective work, to promote water justice. And as we know, and as the book highlights, in fact, Susan Spronk's chapter in the book makes a very strong case about the importance of water justice and the ways in which it intersects with other struggles for racial, gender justice. We talked about Indigenous rights earlier, and climate change, and how all of these issues, when we study water and frontline struggles for water justice, that we can learn about, as the book says, dark clouds or the fault lines in our systems by looking at frontline struggles for water justice. The book also tells us, the book also reveals that in looking at frontline struggles for water justice, and in this case against the privatization of water, the struggles to promote public water, that we have also learned many things, that we are also learning many things about social movement victories and the alternatives that are being built through acts of resistance, through really important grassroots campaigns, and the ways in which communities are coming together. So I really like the way the book brings together really harsh realities with powerful stories about victories and the movements that brought these victories together. So yeah, David, let's just start with you giving an overview of the book and what motivated you to pull this initiative together at this time.
Great. Well, thanks, Meera, and hi, everybody. So I can't see any people, but nice to know that we have what looks like about 65 or 70 people in our audience right now, so that's great. So yeah, this book was, well, accidental, like everything with COVID. We were actually in the midst of starting up a comparative research project on looking at public banks financing public water. And I think we may return to that at some point today. And we had to shut everything down because of COVID. And so one of the things I did was reached out to our network in the water sector, water world, to see if people wanted to look at what was happening, how public water operators were responding to this COVID-19 crisis. And so it was, we can talk a little bit about the selection of the locations, but it was partly also who was available, who could make it work in terms of their personal life and institutional life and bandwidth connections and so on. So it was almost entirely remote research. But in the end, it involved over 30 people working in 20 different countries, as diverse as France, Burkina Faso, Indonesia, and Colombia. So it really does, I think, give us a great global perspective. And as you mentioned, there's two other co-editors, Susan Spronk at the University of Ottawa and Daniel Chavez at the Transnational Institute. And so we've co-published this book with the Transnational Institute and CLACSO, which is the largest network of researchers and publishers in Latin America. And in fact, there'll be a Spanish edition of the book coming out fairly soon. And I'll just maybe very quickly just share the screen for people who might want to download the book. We have a website, the Municipal Services Project website, and municipalservicesproject.org. All of our publications are up here, but this is the book and the cover of the book here, and you can download the entire book or individual chapters. And we'll also be posting the recording of this webinar and the Spanish version of the book as well.
Okay, great. I mean, you say it's remote research, but in fact, it's rooted in a long history of the MSP working, which is with all these groups in all these different places, which is probably why you were able to pull it together so quickly at such a time. And what I have also appreciated about the MSP's work over the years, which I'd like you to kind of address before we get into the contents of the work, about this process of bringing together academics and water operators, workers, grassroots movements, NGOs, so bringing all these people together into conversation with each other. And it's very clear when you read the book that it's actually rooted it's not quick remote research, but it's rooted in long histories of these people doing this work.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Yeah, we're now in 20 years of the Municipal Services Project, and we do have a long history of what I would call scholarly activism, which is grounding our work in sort of real issues on the ground, but also working with community people, working with unions, working with policymakers. And indeed, this book, there's chapters from by community organizations, NGOs, academics, water managers, policymakers at various levels. So yeah, it really is, I think, a cross-section, not just geographically, but in terms of, layers of where people are involved in the debates on water and different worldviews as well. So it's a nice cross-section, and I think it's a very dynamic sense too. Our work is not to try and discover what we think the answers are, but rather to ask probing questions and be prepared for some, not so pleasant responses at times. And indeed, I think this book, as the subtitle suggests, is generally speaking, public water operators, the ones we've done research on, have responded very well to this crisis, but there's some real problems that remain with public water in the world, and there's no point in shying away from that.
No, I like that you put it that way. I mean, and I think it's an important thing to highlight, which the book also does very well, but also I think you do this this has been sort of a theme for the Municipal Services Project, not on the one hand offering a very sharp critique of privatization, and all of the clear evidence that has been built by the various academics who are part of this book, Municipal Services Project, TSI, TNI, all these groups that have documented predatory practices of the private sector and how much they've failed communities. But you're also very clear not to romanticize the public sector, and to look at the fault lines within the public sector, and then this book does that in the context of COVID-19. So the dark clouds are both, privatization and that looming threat of privatization. So even where we have strong public models, the book talks about Uruguay, for example, of being a very solid public model, and that they've actually done an excellent job at this time with the COVID-19 crisis. And yet there is this threat that at the end of this crisis, they will, not privatize, but you will see more reforms of the public operator acting more and more like a private operator, which is, the other threat we face. We face the threat of privatization, and then the threat of reforms that'll force our public utilities to corporatize. And act in very bad ways. Do you want to talk a little bit more about sort of the dark clouds and the kind of range of dark clouds that were revealed in this process?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just preface that by saying that we did select places where we thought generally there's a pretty good water operator in place. So we could have easily have picked places around the world where there are very poor public water operators. And so, this book is not intended to be a representative sample of public water operators. There are, literally hundreds of thousands of them around the world. And remember, public water operators constitute about 85% of water provision today. There's relatively few big systems in particular that are run by private companies. It remains a looming threat, which I'll get to. But so, the threat within the public sector is just poor, corrupt, nepotistic management, but it's also increasingly neoliberal public management and the corporatization, as you've alluded to, of public water, which is over the last 30 years with the influence of neoliberalism, has been forcing public water operators to act effectively like private companies. And we see this across a whole range of sectors, not just water. We see it in electricity, we see it in healthcare, we see it in education, we see it here at Queen's, where students aren't students anymore, they're customers, for example. So there's a whole language and sensibility and operational mandates that are deeply problematic. Just to get quickly to that, as an example of that, in Colombia, this is a bit of an oddity with the book, we had several chapters from Colombia, just in terms of availability. But one of the things that's come out of that experience in Colombia is that where it's a fairly corporatized water model, and so water provision is generally fairly good in terms of quantity and quality, but many of the water operators, again, are forced to think like private companies. So the biggest threat that's emerged out of COVID-19 for public water operators is a financial crisis. They've had dramatic drops in revenues, largely because industry is shut down or slowed down, and a dramatic rise in costs with cleaning protocols and PPE and staff not being able to work on site, et cetera. So there's a very serious financial crisis in many water operators. And we've seen sort of emergency funding flow at various levels in various places. In places like Colombia, they have been responding and saying, well, we're going to make water accessible, and we're going to make sure that people, have their water supplies, et cetera. But they've been very quick to also say, this is not a permanent model. We will revert back to a full cost recovery framework. COVID-19 does not change our basic approach to water delivery, which is one of efficiency-driven, private, management model framework. And so that's a real concern. One would hope that this crisis would have sort of shaken that model up a little bit, because we know that there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who can't afford their water. And most Canadians don't even think about the cost of water. and there's a debate to be had about, do we pay too little for water in Canada? But in many parts of the world, people just can't afford enough water or any water. And so there's, one of the things we've been saying for many years is, whether it's public or private, this sort of cost recovery driven framework of unit-based, make sure that the bottom line breaks even, is deeply problematic. And I think COVID-19 has exposed the realities of that, but I'm not sure that it's going to fundamentally alter the way many of these heavily corporatized water operators think.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, I guess this is the big challenge that's also kind of touched or addressed in some of the chapters around in this book about, and particularly in the global South, where the COVID crisis has been a health crisis, but it's also triggered or precipitated, made worse, economic crises, right? And so if economies are shutting down and and the MSP has been doing really important work on financing and solutions at that level, but it also calls for more discussion on how we publicly finance these utilities and these services, as we should. How do we maintain that? Could you, and this kind of links with your other project, maybe you want to share a little bit about that as alternatives within the public sector for financing.
Yeah, and I'll just make a quick comment on, we typically think of countries in the South where affordability is a real crisis, and lack of investment. But of course, we have a very serious water and sanitation problems here in Canada, particularly in First Nations communities. But in a lot of so-called wealthier countries, we're also seeing very serious affordability issues. And people are often surprised to learn at the number of cutoffs, for example, in the United States. So in 2016 alone, 15 million Americans had their water cut off because they couldn't afford to pay for it. And so there was this scramble at the start of COVID in the States, in Spain, and France, and in many countries, so-called wealthy countries in the world, to quickly try and reconnect people who would have their water disconnected because they couldn't afford to pay for it. And again, that wasn't just private companies, it was a lot of public companies that were doing that. And it fundamentally boils down to the fact that they just don't have the resources. And if the financial model is one of standalone water utilities need to fully recoup their own costs, it's just not feasible in many places. And so we need to think more broadly about what are the broader benefits associated with making sure people have clean, reliable water and sanitation. And so, if water operations need to be run at a loss and subsidized through general taxation or transfers from other parts of the state, then that's the kind of model that needs to be explored more. And around the world, in the United States and Canada included, water operators are generally in a kind of chronic financial crisis. So COVID-19 has made things significantly worse, in the tens of billions of dollars in the States alone, where there's been the most research done on it so far. But it's not clear that there's going to be any obvious solution to this, because austerity continues, the push to do cost recovery on a narrow basis continues. So to get to your question, one of the things we've been looking at is whether public banks could be an option. And many of the listeners here probably are thinking, public bank, what is that? Because we don't really have them in Canada, although we do now have a fairly new, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, set up by the Liberal government. But it's a very different kind of beast. In fact, its mandate is to use public money to leverage private dollars to privatize. And in fact, one of the chapters in this Public Water and COVID-19 book looks at an example of the Canada Infrastructure Bank trying to force a municipality in Ontario to bring the private sector in to run their water services. And it appears, anyways, that the COVID crisis gave pause to council to think about So, it's another example of the fact that just because something is public doesn't mean it operates in the public interest. And many public banks, which are typically state-owned banks, either at the municipal, provincial, or national level, many of them operate like commercial banks, and there's really not much difference. And many of them, in fact, are mandated to try and privatize services. But what we want to do with our research, and we'll be kickstarting this up again this year, is looking at positive examples of public banks that have funded public water operators. And there's lots of examples of them. And in fact, the Netherlands has a public bank that is dedicated solely to financing public water infrastructure. And it's been around for over 50 years. And they specialize in financing water, and they do it very cheaply, they do it very efficiently, and they have a lot of skills and expertise on the water sector. We have relied predominantly in Canada on, if not state funding, then private sector funding, and increasingly trying to bring private finance into the water sector, which is inherently more expensive, and it brings with it a range of other problems. So in any event, that work was, as I mentioned, stalled. So the kind of companion volume to this book on public water and COVID-19 is a book on public banks and COVID-19. And I'll just share with the viewers very quickly here. We also have a website on that. And this is a dedicated website looking at public banks and COVID-19, and it's publicbankscovid19.org. And the book is called Public Banks and COVID-19, Combating the Pandemic with Public Finance. And we've got about 22 chapters looking at experiences of public banks engaging with COVID-19, lending practices, providing support to healthcare providers, expertise for small businesses and households, et cetera. So, there's separate projects with completely separate contributors, et cetera. But that might be something that viewers would be interested in as well. And we also have, as part of that, an interactive map which provides small sort of profiles of different banks. And you get a sense of, this is just a handful of the sort of 900 approximate public banks around the world, but you get a sense of their very global distribution, although North America has very, very few. In fact, there's only one in the United States, the North Dakota State Bank. So anyways, that's something that people might be interested in as well.
So I'm admittedly much less familiar with that research, and it's interesting to see there's quite a bit in the global south as well, so potentially a solution as well in the global south. But as you pointed out, our experience in Canada has not been, or has been with institutions like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which have not fulfilled the kind of mandate you are talking about. Could you speak a little bit more to that? So in terms of distinguishing between the kind of bank and the kind of financing you're talking about and the Canada Infrastructure Bank and other banks like it, which are technically public banks, but used to promote private investment. And I mean, as the chapter highlights, we've seen the failures, particularly through this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the thing to think of public banks is they're just like any other public utility. And one of the things that the finance sector has done is somehow convinced us that there's a kind of rocket science to finance, and there isn't. It's really no different than providing water or electricity or library services. You can have experts in the public sector providing financial services at rates that are generally much cheaper than the private sector can offer. And with mandates that are very different around equity, around green transitions. So there's a bank in Costa Rica, for example, Banco Popular, which is owned by unions in the country. It has government representatives on the board, but their mandates are around financing transition to green renewable energy, and Costa Rica has effectively 100% renewable energy now. They take gender equity seriously in that sector, et cetera. So just because something is owned by the public, though, doesn't mean anything about it. So it can have very, very different ways of operating. So public banks can be operated in the public interest, or they can basically operate in the interest of the private sector. And that's essentially what we've got in Canada, are public banks that are effectively leverages for the private sector to, in the case of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, to get access to public assets, water, ports, airports, et cetera. And Canada has actually become a world leader in sort of leveraging private money into infrastructure, public infrastructure as an asset class. And so I think there's a lot to be learned in Canada from what's happened in other places of the world. And Germany, for example, its transition to renewable energy has been financed almost entirely by public banks. And in Germany, public banks make up about 30% of the banking assets in the country. And they're the little corner bank where you can go and do your deposits. They're also big international banks. And so they have a very vibrant and diverse kind of public banking sector that we really don't have here in Canada. But there's growing demands for it, and I think we need to figure out ways of financing and expanding infrastructure like water and electricity, and making those more equitable and more green through publicly owned financial institutions.
And I do want to talk more about solutions and alternatives and what you call the silver linings. But before we get to that, one thing I'd like for you to elaborate on, which some of the chapters in the book do, is around the question of racial justice and gender justice. So when we look at how we want the state, what an ideal public sector would look like, it is also important to recognize histories of racism, right, and histories of colonialism. And so I think the Greg Reuter's chapter on Cape Town makes that very clear, where you've got the state continuing to perpetuate the historical violence against Black and racialized communities, populations in South Africa. And so, I mean, how and I think that's important in shaping how we think about the public and what we demand of the public. Could you speak more to that?
Mm-hmm. And I think this really gets to the heart of the kind of democratization of the state, and not just the state, because the public needs to be community. It needs to be different actors. And in fact, I remember years ago being at a meeting in Cochabamba in Bolivia, talking about this movement towards remunicipalizing water services and bringing them back under state control. And half the room got up and said, if you want to talk about the state, we're not interested. We don't trust the state. We want to have control. We want to make decisions about our own water services. And a lot of Indigenous communities who have for thousands of years had artisanal water systems that are democratic decision making, et cetera. So whether it's the state or some combination of state and communities, ultimately it's about who is making decisions about who gets what and how that's done. And we know how unequal water access is. We understand the racialized and gendered inequalities in water. It's extremely well documented around the world. And most public water operators are also aware of that. But it's hard to get a public water operator that takes that seriously. It's hard to get that kind of decision making at a kind of day-to-day level. And frankly, a lot of the decisions are made by male engineers who just haven't had any kind of training in this. So they might, know that this is a problem, but it's not, part of the way they think about infrastructure. And so I think the best public water operators are one that engage with, communities in meaningful ways. They listen to frontline workers, and there's a very participatory, transparent understanding of what needs to be done differently. And the good news is, I think that the best progress on this front has probably been in the water sector. And that's in part because it's a pretty straightforward sector. It doesn't, it's not rocket science. I mean, finance isn't rocket science either, but everybody understands water. It's pretty simple. You draw it out of the ground, you put it through pipes, you clean it, and you drink it. And so, people, I think there's been quite a strong movement in the water sector to democratize. And so I think in other sectors, there's a lot to be learned from the water sector. But man, we're a long, long way from equity globally and within countries. So it's an ongoing struggle.
So, I mean, that's a good segue to what democratization means and what some of the solutions are, that have been championed around the world that are also discussed in the book. As you mentioned, the community-based water systems. The public doesn't just mean the state, but it's also community-based water systems. The book talks about public-public partnerships or water operator partnerships, in order to enhance the capacity of utilities that are weaker, or communities, to empower communities to develop their own solutions. The book talks about, Blue Communities Project. It talks about a number of different solutions that are being championed around the world. And because these webinars tend to be so depressing, I thought we should leave enough time to discuss solutions and messages of hope that have come up.
Sure. Before I do that, let me just give you one last sort of gloomy prognosis, because I think I haven't actually said this directly yet, but I think it's important for listeners to be aware of it, that this financial crisis amongst water operators, and it's only going to be more difficult post-COVID because governments are going to be stretched, and it's not just the water sector that's been hard hit. So recovering from this financial crisis as a result of COVID is going to be difficult across the board. And I think one of the concerns here is not just a sort of doubling down on cost recovery, but I think we're seeing a big push to actually promote privatization. The Brazilian government has been using it as an opportunity to say, hey, we can't afford to invest in water anymore. We need to bring the private sector back in. This was already ongoing under Bolsonaro. But certain cities in the States, Philadelphia, for example, has already started to explore privatization because of the financial crisis. The World Bank and other multilateral institutions, some UN agencies have already started to re-promote private investment in the water sector after having sort of backed away for a while. And private companies are very bullish on the prospects, post-COVID prospects, because it just sort of illustrated the inelasticity of demand. Everyone needs water, and the potential to make money here is there. And so, in fact, we've seen a flurry of mergers and acquisitions in the water sector, including Veolia trying to buy out Suez, the two biggest private water companies in the world. So, it's kind of crazy what's happening. And so there's, I think, a real renewed threat of aggressive privatization in the water sector as a result of COVID-19. But let me get to some of the more positive aspects of what's going on. And I sort of in the introduction to the book break down in a table some of the key positive results of what we saw in this research. So there's half a dozen of them or so. I'll just quickly go through those. One, I think what was really remarkable, it was just how dedicated the staff, management, frontline staff, policymakers were. And it comes out again and again in terms of enormous amount of overtime people put in, working in very difficult circumstances, sometimes quite dangerous, a lot of uncertainty, particularly the start of the pandemic around, what it meant for sewage workers and frontline workers. And I think it's important. There really has been very little media coverage of water workers, and yet they've been very, very important and have really put themselves at risk in a whole bunch of ways. A lot of these water operators also really bent over backwards to ensure access to water and reducing prices, making water free, reconnecting people's water if they'd been cut off. There was a lot of moratoriums placed on water cutoffs in the United States. That's actually an ongoing movement in the States, is to try and just stop water cutoffs, period. So it'll hopefully sort of kickstart some of those and politicize some of those movements. Emergency services installed in informal settlements and refugee settlements, et cetera. So a lot of time and effort put into emergency service provision, and a lot of quite innovative stuff that we saw in the public sector as well, in terms of their crisis response, developing online services, some creative repair things going on with workers talking to people on the phone about how to fix their plumbing, and some interesting stories on that front. Some great public education campaigns around hand washing, around virus tracking, and some of the interesting stuff going on in sewage, and just relieving people's anxiety that water was safe. It's okay to drink. It's okay to wash your hands. A lot of really positive messaging going on there. Some of the cases, they showed a kind of an expanded democratic process, reaching out to community members, reaching out to workers, frontline workers, trying to figure out ways to operate in this crisis. And so there's some very positive examples of that kind of democratizing of public water operators. And then the one that you referred to, I think is certainly one of the most positive benefits of it, is the collaboration that we've seen amongst water operators, sort of public partnerships. A lot of these were sort of informal things, sometimes on a very sort of regional basis. There's a chapter in Finland about different municipalities working with one another. There's a chapter about France and a kind of pan-country initiative to get public water operators sharing ideas and experiences. And then at the regional levels as well, in the EU, there's a group called Aqua Publica Europea, which was coordinating public water operators across Europe to share best practices. And then at a global level, there's a UN agency called the Global Water Operators Partnership Alliance, and they were coordinating public water operators internationally with webinars and best practices and support and so on. So we really saw a lot of great coordination, reaching out to help other public water operators and indeed public water operators helping in other sectors. And that's, I think, for us, what fundamentally distinguishes public from private is that you can have a holistic worldview and you can think about, well, how does public water relate to public health, relate to electricity, et cetera. And so we see a lot of that in the responses from the public water operators was, what makes us public? How do we share our experiences? How do we build solidarity within the country, across borders? And there's a great chapter in the book about Flint, Michigan, which I'm sure everyone will be aware of, the tainted water and lead poisoning. And ironically, COVID has been helped to sort of rebuild trust. And it's been a long, hard road since the lead crisis, and it's certainly not over. But again, somewhat ironically, the new public water operator there has been able to use COVID as a way to demonstrate, hey, we're committed to trying to work with you as a community to resolve what's going on here. So if Flint can make it work, then I think there's a lot of hope for other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has helped that the criminal governor that they had in Flint is no longer in office and being pursued for his criminal actions as well. But it highlights the need to, or the ways in which we can build on former victories and towards towards solutions. I am just noting, I should say, I want to say hello to everybody who's introducing themselves on the chat. We've quite a few people from Queen's University, which we expected, lots of wonderful masters and PhD and undergraduate students from Queen's University. We also have folks here from around the world, from Uganda, from Australia, from the United States. So quite a few people joining us from other parts of the world. And also, I think a few authors of book chapters. I see Farhana Sultana's here. Hi, Farhana, and Mary Grant is here. So I don't know if any of you want to say anything. We say something for. I guess we have a few more minutes before we wrap up. So let me know if you want to speak. And Susan Spronk, who's also got a chapter in the book. I see my friend and colleague Maud Barlow is here. Hi, Maud. Karen Jordan. QP also has a chapter in the book. So just want to acknowledge everybody who's joined. And we have a question from Stephen Brown, who says, hi, David, the Chicago Mercantile Market just introduced trading in water futures. How do you see that interacting with the financial pressures of the pandemic-driven economic crisis to affect public control of water resources?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Actually, you mentioned Maud on the webinar here. She wrote a commentary on that recently. My hope is that it's such a marginal thing with a very narrow market that it's not going to catch on. I think the water market is so complicated, and particularly the domestic water market, challenging to commodify in terms of affordability and sort of complicated by questions of right to water, et cetera, that I would be surprised if we see a deepening of that particular type of exchange. I think the real threat we have in the water sector is finance capital looking for speculative investments in equity ownership, where they will swoop in, buy up equity in a private water company or a privatized public water operator, and then squeeze whatever they can out of it for profits, and then dump it and sell it and run. And so we're seeing, and with infrastructure development, there's all kinds of ways in which water is being broadly financialized. So it's not to say, Stephen, that isn't, I think that example is particularly kind of gross in terms of its crude calculation on water pricing. But I think it's a pretty marginal activity. I think that the deeper threat is big equity finance investing in water. And let me flag here too, it's the biggest threat perhaps of all is public pension funds. So these are publicly owned pension funds, like the Teachers Pension Fund in Ontario, which own private water utilities around the world. The Teachers Pension Fund in Ontario owns basically all of the privatized water utilities in Chile. And again, the Canadian public pension funds are at the cutting edge of this form of de facto privatization. And in some cases, the members of these public unions are opposed to privatization, but their pension funds are investing in the privatization of water, electricity, and a whole range of other things. So I think the ongoing financialization of water and other services is a very, very serious threat.
Great. Just saying hello to Anne Lestat, who just says hello on the chat, and the former deputy mayor of Paris, who played a big part in the remunicipalization of that utility. I don't see more questions in the Q&A, so please feel free to add to the Q&A if you want any questions answered. But otherwise, if anyone, and particularly those who have chapters in the book, want to say a few words, I can actually promote you to the status of a panelist. So just let me know if or you can raise your hand, and I'll do that. Raise your hand raise your virtual hand, your Zoom hand, and I will promote you to a panelist. Okay, one more question from Reba Paul. How can public waters build their confidence to engage the private sectors? And okay, this is sort of, this is somebody who wants to know how the public sector can attract the private sector, which is sort of the opposite of what we're saying in this book, right? That we want, we're not looking to attract investments, and that those models of private-public partnerships have failed, and this is what the COVID-19 crisis has even further emphasized, is how much the private sector and private investments are not up to the task of addressing our big public health concerns and distributing water and sanitation services equitably. Did you have anything more to say on that, David?
No, I don't think so. I just wanted to make a comment. You mentioned Anne Lestrade watching, who sort of steered the remunicipalization of water in Paris 10, 11 years ago now. And some viewers may be aware there has been quite a significant increase over the last 15 years of towns and cities making their water public again after a period of privatization. What COVID has done, there's an interesting chapter in the book about Jakarta where the momentum to re-municipalize was growing quite strong. And now there's some pushback from the state to say, well, maybe we shouldn't re-municipalize because of the financial crisis. So that's a kind of a potential dark cloud on the remunicipalization front. But I think the silver lining there is that I think this crisis demonstrates for people that water has to be a public good. It has to be accessible to everybody. It has to be affordable to everybody. And we may very well see an increase in the push to remunicipalize. And indeed, it was the cholera outbreaks of the 1800s which led, to the first wave of municipalizations. Most water operators in the world started off in public hands, and they just, weren't able to deal with these cholera outbreaks. And there was a broad push to make them public and to bring them under municipal control. And so we might very well see an increase in demands for publicizing water again as a result of COVID-19. So we'll see how that pans out.
Great. We also have Marcela Gonzalez saying hello, who's also an author in the book. Just to the questions on private investment and the failures of the public sector, I would just encourage folks to read the book and the other research of the Municipal Services Project, which has done a really good job of highlighting the failures of privatization, but also of not romanticizing the public sector. We're talking about, the public sector as, deprivatizing as a starting point, getting rid of the threat of private financing, private ownership as a starting point, and building from there. That is not to say that the public sector is perfect, right? And that and the Municipal Services Project has done enough work on how to build better public systems. So I would encourage folks to read the book and learn more about the other research of the Municipal Services Project.
I just did read the question about private engagement there. If I understood the question properly, the person is asking, about public water operators building capacity to engage effectively with the private sector. And it's actually a really good point because, not everything about water needs to be public, but, we don't need to have engineering firms that can build some of the basic infrastructure. It's that a lot of that stuff can get contracted out to the private sector. Not every municipality is going to have the capacity to build infrastructure. So there is a lot of engagement with the private sector. And it's important that the public sector has the capacity to negotiate good contracts on those kinds of short-term construction projects, but also that they have the wherewithal to resist the pressures from private companies to do more and take over management and take on long-term contracts, et cetera. And one of the problems we have in the world is that you've got companies like Veolia and Suez with tens of thousands of employees around the world, thousands of lawyers and accountants and so on, and they swoop in to countries and cities with relatively little capacity to negotiate on these things. And it's a real problem. And so I think being savvy as a public water operator about what role the private sector should and shouldn't be playing is really important. If we acknowledge that not every water operator is going to have the capacity to do every single thing on its own and might need to contract out construction and so on to private companies, then yes, it's really important that they have that kind of capacity to engage with the private sector and an understanding of at what point you don't want the private sector operating things, what needs to be done by the public sector.
No, thanks for that clarification. There's also a question in the chat about corruption in the public sector, and that's where I think your chapter, the chapter on community-based water systems, is important. And I know you've done other research, or collaborators at the Municipal Services Project have done other research on that issue of community-based water systems. So where communities have rejected the state as the as the form of public operation, utility services that they want. We've got these wonderful models of community-based, flawed in all of the same ways, but also that there are really strong solutions emerging out of that sector. Do you want to say more to that, David?
Yeah, and I think part of it is practical. If the state is extremely corrupt, if the state is very weak, in some cases the state is effectively non-existent. You can talk all you want about a good public water operator, but it ain't going to happen overnight. And so in a lot of particularly rural communities, people are scrambling to figure out ways to make things work. But it's also a philosophical position that different communities have around the notion, as I alluded to earlier, that water isn't just something that we should consume as sort of passive recipients. That water is meaningful. It has a political meaning. It has spiritual meaning. It has cultural meaning, and that we want to be part of that decision-making process. That it's important to our identity as a community. And there are many, particularly Indigenous communities around the world who feel very strongly about that. So there's a kind of philosophical position around community control, decision making, etc. And in some cases, it's a very strong, we want to do it on our own. In some cases, it's a how do we maintain community control while still working with the state and getting the kind of benefits that we can get with engineering expertise and finance and economies of scale, et cetera. So there's quite a broad gradation. And I think for listeners who aren't as familiar with these debates, the biggest misconception is that it's public versus private. The shades in between these things are quite dramatic. What does public mean, first of all? What does private mean? Where's the community fit into all of this? It's an incredibly complex kaleidoscope of actual realities on the ground, and some of that is shaped by the pragmatics of what's happening in place. Some of it is driven by the sort of different philosophical perspectives. So I think there's no perfect public model, and it's hard. One of the things we're trying to do with this book is is highlight lessons. What has one place done well that might be learned from another place, but that's not always easily transferable, and what might work well in one place might not be suitable in another place. So it's a very very complex and murky thing, but in the end, I think there's some fundamentally positive lessons that we can learn from what public water operators can do in a crisis like COVID-19 that private water operators simply aren't able and aren't willing to do.
So there's two more case studies that I think are really important in highlighting where we could bring the public sector to operate. I mean, there's a few actually, not just the two, but I mean, there's certainly the model of Eau de Paris. There's the Terrassa case, which is highlighted in the book. There's also the Venezuelan popular water, I can't remember what they call it, but basically that it's not about leaving the public sector to do its thing. It's about creating structures of accountability in order to democratize our water and sanitation services. Could you speak more to those?
Yeah, and they're very exciting, but I think for those Canadian observers, again, I get back to this point about sort of being passive recipients of many of our public services. We turn on the tap, we flick on the light, we can afford it, it's safe, and we really don't think about it ever again. But in places where it's not safe or it's not affordable, or again where there's a kind of philosophical difference, or a sense that we need to be engaged with these things, then there's a very different kind of dialogue and dynamic that's going on. And I think in some places people are like, well, I don't really want to be involved in these debates. I'm just sort of happy to turn on my tap, and maybe that's a good thing. But I think in Canada we're sort of blind to all of the kind of ugliness behind the ease with which we have many of our services. And we're aware of the fact that there's a lot of First Nations communities which continue to this day to have boil water advisories and poor water access, et cetera. But there's a lot of other problems going on with our public services. So I think, for a Canadian and to some extent American audience, there's a lot to be learned from the very dynamic and exciting and engaged politicization of water services in other parts of the world. And Europe, I think, is a particularly exciting place. Spain and France have some incredibly dynamic debates around public control and public input and democratization of services. And so I think it's incumbent upon Canadians not just to simply be passive recipients of water and electricity and other services, but to sort of force ourselves to think about where are these things coming from, who's getting them, who isn't, who's making decisions on these things. And I think this book is a good example of how a crisis like COVID both exposes the ugly underbelly of it, but also helps to shine a light on the really dynamic and positive citizen movements that are out there.
Great. We have 2 minutes left, or a minute left. I just, as a way to wrap up, the book starts with a quote from Arundhati Roy about how the pandemic and pandemics historically have been a way to reimagine the world. She talks about it being a portal or a gateway between one world and the next. And you highlight in this book how public water, right, and how what you've learned through the snapshot of public water services around the world in the has provided a bit of a portal into the future. Any last words on that to wrap up?
Yeah, well, I mean, water, unlike anything else, it really has no substitute. As much as we might like to think we can survive on beer, we need water. And I think it's something that everybody can understand and relate to. And so, again, using water as a way to both reveal the inequalities and injustices in the world, but also as a way of understanding how we can make the world a better place, a more equitable, more sustainable kind of place. So it's one of the reasons I love working on water specifically, is it's because everybody understands it, everybody knows its importance, and we can also change the way we think about and work with water. So I'm just hoping that the biggest silver lining from COVID-19 is that it will help to push water and water resources even further into our understanding of the things that need to change in this world.
Okay, thank you, David. It's been lovely chatting for an hour with you.
Yeah, thank you, Meera.
Thanks to everybody who joined. Really lovely to have all of you with us. I strongly encourage you to look up the book, download it, share it, and I guess use it, right? Use it in your local campaigns. And
it will be coming out in Spanish soon as well. So
excellent. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.